is Eileen Hart. I'm a Master Gardener for Hillsborough County, and today we are going to look at ferns. I've been collecting ferns since, let's see, 1973. When Derek Birch came down was brought down from the Missouri Botanical Gardens to set up the USF Botanical Garden. He brought these ferns I had never seen, and they were these giant things. Well, this is one of them right here. Great big ferns. I got really interested in the ferns and how they are identified. So I'm going to give a little bit of general information today, and then I'm going to do how to cultivate ferns and then propagation. So that's kind of the way it goes. And I wander, so if I wander too much, just follow me later. Okay, identification of ferns is usually through the fern spores. Well, there are lots of ways. They're a plant, so there are lots of ways to identify them. But one of the easiest ways is by the spores. And every fern in the mature form has spores. And this is a spore on a staghorn fern. And then these are more spores. And one lady told me one time that she just couldn't grow spores. She had one of these holly ferns. She said, I just can't grow ferns, because she said there are all those bugs all over the back of them. And so everybody was laughing because that's your spores. That's the way they propagate themselves. And this is another one, big one with spores. Maybe you can see it really well. Can you see that? Anyway, so these spores are in a different pattern. And on this little plant here, the spores are what is called dimorphic. There are fertile fronds and sterile fronds. So, but there's a different language with ferns, and you have to think about that. They don't go by the regular nomenclature, the regular identifications. They have instead of a leaf, they have a frond, and instead of seeds, they have spores. And the stem is a stipe, and it goes on and on like that. So if you really want to get into the study of ferns, which is the study is pteridology. So we have some ferns that are called terrace ferns, but pteridology is the study of ferns. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go over some interesting things about ferns and non-ferns before I really get into some of the other stuff. When we talk about ferns, and you see people bringing plants to you, and they'll say, oh, I brought you a fern today, and they'll bring you what is called like asparagus fern. This is not a fern. It is an asparagus. And this is Asparagus plumosa. It is an asparagus. It is not, I think they're still in the lily family. And then this is one of the giant asparagus. And this is what is called a foxtail fern, and it is not a fern at all. It is a seed-bearing plant. You'll see on all these asparagus, you'll see that they have little white blooms and then red berries. So if the plant that somebody brings you has a flower on it, it is not a fern. Ferns only reproduce by spores. There are some Fern Allies too. This is a Selaginella. And this is an equisetum, which is also called horsetail. We have native ones that grow in our swamps. So those are kind of just to make sure that people understand that there are just ferns and then Fern Allies. Okay, I'm going to go over a few of these ferns here that I have on my table. There are 12,000 plus species of ferns worldwide. There's an argument about Florida that there are between 207 and 220, so you couldn't really get carried away with as many ferns as you possibly could stand. So I'm going to show you a few species and the differences in those species. This is our maidenhair fern. that I'm showing here. These are different ones in the maidenhair family. This is a large pinnate one. And this is another one. This is our native fern that grows in the sides of these calcareous sinkholes. I don't know if many people like to go into the sinkholes, but that's where you'll find them. They like it. When you think about that, when you're growing them, you really need to use calcium, a lot of calcium carbonate. I've even taken concrete blocks and chopped them up and planted them in concrete blocks. They like that a lot. The sides of your house, if you have a stucco or concrete block house, yeah. Okay, that's one group of, just in that one genus of fern. And then these are some of the pyrotias. This is Pyrotia lingua, and this is a petticoating form and a serrated form and just a creped form. And then this is another different pyrotia. And then this little plant here is a pyrotia too. So, you know, you can go on and on with those. Okay, when people think about ferns, they usually think about the Boston type. And a lot of people think, I don't want to fool with Boston types because a lot of them are invasive. But there are something like 150 different cultivars of the Boston type fern. And you will see different names, just a very slight difference, and they'll name it something else. So these are two of the forms. This one is Rooseveltii, and this one is a petticoating form of the fern that gives us so much trouble, but it's a petticoating form. A gal in the Fern Society that grew she only had 2 plants, ferns that she grew. She had this petticoating form that she fed and babied a lot, and the petticoating part, this end part, was about this wide. So this whole huge basket of ferns was absolutely spectacular. Okay, they're a group called Polypodiums, meaning many-footed, so this is one of them. And then this one. And this one. They don't look much like ferns, do they? But they are. And then you have of course, ferns here. And there is another. This is another terrace fern. So, see, I'm just going on and on about all the different ferns there are. When you think about 12,000 ferns there, you can pick and choose whatever you want. All right, we're going to now talk a little bit about culture of ferns. And number one is light. That they really are shade-loving plants. They prefer to be in the shade. Now, there's exceptions to all rules, and you'll see some of them, like in the wild, you'll see some ferns at the very tops of trees, like the Sphagnum Moss, our bird's nest fern, will be at the top of a tree, and in cramped little quarters in between 2 great big limbs. So you know that it likes the sun. I mean, it likes a lot of light, maybe not full sun, but a lot of light, and it likes for its roots to be crowded. So you have to, if you can see stuff in the wild, then you'll really know how it should be growing. So, but most of them prefer shade. So all these ferns here that I have put around my table are in shade, either in a greenhouse or growing under trees, or in a place like this that's pretty shaded. Okay, the next thing is water, and we do have a couple of water ferns in Florida that actually live in the water, like in our creek systems and stuff. But most of them just like to have moisture. So that would be humidity. And I think we have humidity. My sweat is running down my face right now, so I know there's lots of humidity right this minute. Anyway, that's one of the things they really love, is the humidity. If they're growing in hanging baskets like this fern right here, or this one, you want to make sure that they get, any of them that are in hanging baskets or pots, you want to make sure that they don't dry out totally. There are exceptions to that rule too. Some of the great big footed ferns say like an aglamorpha. I know I'm supposed, it doesn't have a common name, so I can't say its common name, but that's its genus, and they like to dry out. So those are the exceptions, and a lot of people don't even grow those types of ferns. So just remember, if you water them well, like once a week in the dry, like in our spring when it's really dry, then you should be okay. And if the basket gets really dried out, drop it in a pot of water, a container of water, and just soak it really, really good. And then hang it up and let it dry out. You can actually put these, like if you're growing ferns in the house, which is difficult because they like the humidity, but you can use the ones that have entire fronds, like say this plant over here, or the one down below, this one, are staghorn ferns. Then what you do with those is you put them in your bathtub and soak them really good and let them drain, and then put them back where they were. So that way they really have, get their whole root system good and wet, but they dry out. Okay, the next thing is soils, and with soils, I use what is called peat and perlite, and that is Canadian peat. This is the Canadian peat, and I mix it with perlite, and the perlite's for drainage, and that's what I use for some of the ferns for propagation. And then this is the sphagnum moss, which I use in all the baskets. Any of the hanging baskets, I use the sphagnum moss. So that's one of the reasons you'll need to get them good and wet once a week in the dry season, or well, whatever. I lost my train of thought there. Anyway, so those are the two main soils that I use, but you'll find that they'll grow just about anywhere. When you think about ferns growing in the wild, they grow in all the mulch, and then they grow up the trees. When you look around, if you could look around here, you'll see plants growing all the way up a tree, and that means that they're getting their moisture, everything from all the leaves that the tree is collecting, and it's like in the palms and the fronds, yeah. So that's, and I don't. The other note was what I'd said before. Put the calcium carbonate in your soil if you're growing maidenhairs. That usually works really well. Containers, I don't think ferns really care as long as you follow the other rules. And so I use plastic pots. I use clay pots. I use this is tree fern fiber. They're planted in the well, it's actually in rounds of tree fern that are cut, and they used to have a moratorium on that. They said that in South America they were ruining the tree fern population, or in Australia or these other countries, but they decided, I guess it's because they're cutting them down anyway. They might as well get, to grow agricultural crops, so they might as well chop them up and sell them. So anyway, some of the specialty nurseries have the tree fern fiber. Okay, the next thing is insects and diseases. And you don't get the main thing you get diseases with a fern is getting them too wet. So they like to be damp, but they don't want to be really wet. So just try not to get them too wet. Make sure they drain really well. And you shouldn't have any problem with the funguses, etc. If you start getting a fungus, like in a hanging basket, then you're probably going to need to take the plant apart and put it in a different container. And maybe you treat it with a fungicide. I don't do that. I usually just let them dry out more and then replant them in another container. Cut the dead and dying part off and then replant them. Insects, I don't have too much problem with insects. The grasshoppers get on them every now and then, but they're mainly just taking bites out of them because they're heading for all of your amaryllis and all your lilies. And so they're just checking out where the lilies are, and so while they're sitting on your fern, they take bites out of it. So other than that, I don't have much problem with insects with them. I try to cultivate a lot of other creatures, like lizards and birds and etc. Make it kind of jungly, and there are more good things than there are bad things. I think for every insect that's going to bother your plants, you've got 7 or 8 that are going to wipe them out. So just try to let things be natural, and don't spray very much. And one of the things that I try to tell people all the time is these are living things, ferns, begonias, bromeliads, whatever. They need to be checked. If they're, we feed our cats and dogs and husbands and spouses and whatever 2 or 3 times a day. And so when you think about a plant, it's alive. So at least go out once a week and check and see what's happening with your plants. And then you'll notice way ahead when there is something going on, whether it's fertilizer damage or insect damage, fungal damage, or just too hot, too cold, whatever. So I can't say enough about checking your plants. The next thing is fertilizers. I don't use a whole lot of fertilizer. I do use pellet fertilizer in the spring, and Nutricoat is one of the ones I use. And I just, when I'm redoing baskets or putting new soil in pots, I put a little bit of the Nutricoat in too. We have so much nitrogen in our rain, well, what is it, 80% of our air we breathe is nitrogen. So you have a lot of nitrogen, so every time it lightens, especially in the summer, you don't need to fertilize at all on ferns. They do need a little bit of the phosphorus and potassium, but if they're going to form spores, but as far as being green, they need the nitrogen. So that's the main thing. Fish emulsion is one of the ones that people have used in the Fern Society to make sure they've got big, lush, green plants. I've used it a couple of times. Your husband doesn't like you to come back in the house. Your neighbors kind of hate you. The cats love you. The cats come, and so it's one way to attract all your feral cats is to start spraying fish emulsion. Okay, so far we are on a, there's no way for me to for you to ask questions, so we're going to go on and go into propagation. So we're going to show you a little bit about what to do with these plants as far as getting new ones. And first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about propagation today, and the first thing is spores. Now, a lot of people think, well, why should I fool with spores when I can go buy a plant down at the big box or wherever? Well, if you're out in a botanical garden, or even at your neighbor's house, or at a Master Gardener program, and somebody brings some rare ferns and you go, oh, I'd love to have one of those. Well, the person may not be willing to cut up their plant for cuttings, but they would give you a fertile frond that you can take home and grow them from spores. It's a long time process, because after you plant them, it takes 4 months to a year before you get any what is called a prothalia, which are green. It's like a green slime, and then you get the new babies. If you've got a greenhouse or you've got a wet spot in your yard, you get ferns coming up anyway. So you see what they look like when they're in the process of growing, if you pay attention to the stuff we weed out of our greenhouses. So, or our back porches, or wherever you have a wet spot. So what I use for growing spores is this is an old container that had a crack in the bottom, and so you want a cover on it, because you're going to treat this like a terrarium. In fact, terrariums are a great place to grow spores, and you can watch them, set them on your table out on your porch or wherever. And then I use peat and perlite. You can use sphagnum moss. One of the easiest things is African violet potting soil, because it's already been sterilized as far as seeds. There are always weed seeds floating around and fungal seeds. And you can sterilize your own. You just put it in the microwave and zap it. And guess what? Your house, your kitchen's going to smell like dirt, but that's all right as long as you have your sterilized soil. So that's essentially what they do to it, is they kill all the seeds that would be in that soil. Anyway, then you scrape. Oh, first of all, you have to wet this soil down. You wet it really good, and I go ahead and use hot water, boiling water, and pour over it, and that just cuts down any other fungus that might be floating around. And let it cool down. You don't want to do any more when it's really hot. Let it cool down, and then you take your spores, and you want them to be brown in most cases. There are very few ripe spores that are not brown. There's one or two that are green. And then you just scrape there, and each one of these little itty bitty little pieces that are called sporangia are just millions of little spores. So then you scrape this off into, you don't need, if somebody just gives you that much of the frond, you're way ahead, because you just scrape a lot of this off into your wet container. It has to stay wet so the sperm can get to the egg. So, and then your Propagation forms, and then your new little fern. And when they get to be about an inch and a half tall, that's 2 inches, then take tweezers and you can transplant them with tweezers into potting soil. But make sure that they stay covered and protected for a while, because they're very tender being closed in like this in the terrarium. Yeah. So, okay, that's spores. Okay, the next thing is the footed ferns. And this is an aglomorpha, and this is the foot, if you can believe that. And this is the top of it. It's like our bear's foot fern that grows wild on our cabbage palms. And what you do in a case like this, you want to make sure this growing tip is out of your media. I plant these in sphagnum moss. And what you want to do with the top part is take it off. Now, propagation, this is not the super scientific propagation. This is dooryard propagation, which is what all of us are if you're growing at your own home. It's whatever we have in our yard. Whatever, I use a steak knife, and I use my hands, and I cut things back severely. What you want to do with your sphagnum moss, you want to make sure it's good and wet and packed down in your container. And then you take this fern frond, foot, and it's hardened off. I took it off the major plant. It's hardened off. This is the base of its rhizome. And that part goes down in your sphagnum, and then you pack in your soil around it. Well, soil is your sphagnum. And it should not, it should just keep right on growing. It should send out another frond. Probably won't be until the spring, but it'll get its roots going, and then you can put it into a hanging basket. Or I have the major plant of this, since it gets really huge. I have it growing in a stump, so I don't know how other people do these things, but yeah, you can have a lot of fun with old stumps and great big pots, and also tie them on trees just like you do staghorns. Okay, the next one to propagate is this. This is called a mother fern, and we have quite a few mother ferns in each different genus. We have what is called a mother fern, and if on the end of each one of these fronds are babies. Can you see that? They're little baby ferns. And what this does in nature, they hit the ground, they tack down, and then a new little fern is formed. So what you do to propagate this, you just cut these little bulbets. That's what they're called, bulbets. You cut it off, and I plant it in peat and perlite. And make sure that center part has access to the air. And that would be, and that's how you propagate that. This is another Dahlia, like a rabbit's foot fern. This one's called Heterophylla, and no, Heterophylla, sorry. And what I do, here's it's called a rhizome, and that's where all of your little fronds come up. And I make a little circle with it. You'll see their little roots already started. And then I put this in sphagnum moss too. There's probably not room in. Should have brought another pot, but I didn't. And make sure that growing tip, that's your meristem, you want that growing tip out of the sphagnum. But I cover all the rest of it up. And leave the growing tip out. Okay, so that's that's the way to propagate their footed ferns. And a lot of these are footed. This one's footed. This is a native fern. There's two more native ferns there, and they both grow by taking that rhizome and planting it sphagnum moss. Okay, that's about all I have for today. But if you have any questions, I guess call into the Ag Center. I know with all this new way of doing our programs, we'll have to figure out a way to get questions and answers done. So, and that's it for today. Thank you very much.